Virginia Holman. I'm the chapter leader of Island Wildlife, which is the North Carolina Wildlife Federation chapter serving the Cape Fear region. And we are very happy to welcome Carson Wood this evening. Carson is a biologist and a specialist on threatened and endangered species of the Southeast and a USGS certified bird bander with over 10 years of experience working in the natural resource field in both public and private sectors, most recently with the Coastal Plain Conservation Group, which was founded by Carson with his father, Andy Wood. He currently serves as a natural resource manager for Coastal Carolina Resource Group, advising clients on stormwater management to safeguard our coastal aquatic resources. Carson has been working with red-cockaded woodpeckers since 2003, and we're very excited to have him with us this evening. Thank you so much, Carson.
My pleasure. Shall I just dive in?
Go for it. We're ready.
Excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Carson Wood. I am the biologist for Coastal Plain Conservation Group. We were founded in 2012 with my father, Andy Wood, who is a local conservationist here in southeastern North Carolina, really because there are two species of interest for he and I. For him, it's been the magnificent Ramshorn Snail, which is a species of snail that is endemic to the lower Cape Fear region that is now extinct in the wild due to saltwater intrusion, which I know you guys will be having another talk on here shortly, and habitat alteration. They historically were found in beaver ponds along the lower Cape Fear, and due to dredging of the lower Cape Fear River and the historical extirpation of the beaver, we lost that habitat. So for approximately 27 years, my father's been the caretaker for that species, along with another snail that is equally, if not more, imperiled, the Greenfield Ramshorn Snail, named for Greenfield Lake here in New Hanover County. And it's one that we're not even sure if it exists in the wild anymore, just like the magnificent Ramshorn Snail. So, and then my aspect that I brought to CPCG in terms of forming it was passion for the conservation of red-cockaded woodpeckers. It's a species that I essentially grew up around. My family and I moved to the Hampstead area in 2003 and happened to live on a piece of property that shared foraging habitat, and I'll get into what that is later, for a family group of red-cockaded woodpeckers. And so I got to know the species very intimately over time and really appreciate how unique they are, and the ecosystems that they rely on are equally unique, if not more so, here in southeastern North Carolina throughout their range, because they historically had a very, very large range, and we'll get to that in a little bit. This is a challenge that I normally have feedback from my audience for as a fun startup photo. And what I like to do is say, well, who here can tell me which one is the RCW? And of course, through a show of hands, or saying which quadrant they're in, they'll tell me which one is the RCW. And I will look at everyone and say, I'm sorry, that was a cruel joke, because none of them are. So I'll get a lot of folks inquiring to me as to the woodpecker they've seen in their backyard most recently, with either a orange cap like you see on the red-bellied woodpecker and the pileated woodpecker. Can you see the bird photo now?
Yes, it is advancing now, so we are good to
Excellent, excellent. Okay. So, without further ado, this is the list of the species that you'll most likely encounter in your backyard. Sans the ivory-billed woodpecker, nuthalls, and three-toed. The ivory bill is, so far as we know, extinct in the southeast. and the potential Cuban subspecies has not been recorded in some time. But I like to throw this in there as a challenge because a lot of times I'll get somebody who, even though they are emphatic that they have seen a red-cockaded woodpecker, and I do wish they had, most times it'll either be a downy, hairy, red-bellied, red-headed, or pileated, or northern flicker. And the issue with that, not so much issue, is just that it's a misnomer for the species. When you hear red-cockaded, you immediately think, oh, there's going to be bright red visible to me right away, but not so much. And this photo right here kind of demonstrates why that is the case. You have the size of the species. They're approximately 7 inches long. They're not a large woodpecker, approximately the size of a bluebird, for those of you that have seen bluebirds in our area. And then here is the key takeaway from this bird. The male right here has the small red cockade. And that cockade is only visible on the males when they become agitated and will move up the feathers covering that to show everybody that's, hey, look at me, I'm a male. I am defending my territory. I don't like what you're doing. And it goes back to a story that's been shared with me, and I assume at this point it's kind of a common knowledge story, is that during the Revolutionary War, more than likely Civil War as well, the soldiers would wear 2 different feathers in their caps, particularly officers. And these 2 feathers would be a red and a black feather. And when the officers were in the field, they would cover the red feather designating their rank with the black feather, and it was the cockade. And that way snipers would not see that red feather and say, "Oop, there's an officer. I need to take them out and make sure that they can't command their troops." And that's the one story that has always stuck with me as to the name for the red-cockaded woodpecker. But as I said, the males have that little cockade, and then when they're juveniles, they have a red spot on the top of their head. Females lack the cockade and the red spot. So that's just one way that we can identify sex from field characteristics. This is the historic and current range for red-cockaded woodpeckers. The historic range are the blue counties that are shaded in. And I like to take a moment and appreciate the scale of this map. And it probably doesn't even really capture the full extent of the species. You have, some spots all the way up past Maryland into New Jersey, and then, all the way south to Miami, and even further some, and then west to Texas and Oklahoma. There are still some RCWs in Oklahoma. We had birds in Missouri, in Kentucky, and there are some scattered reports from Ohio. A vast, vast range. And it was intimately tied in with fire-dependent ecosystems. And when European settlers came in, fire suppression was the #1 goal, because fire meant they lost their homes, lost whatever crops they were able to grow. So taming and managing the forest was their #1 goal. So we saw the loss of native people's use of fire in management in the Southeast for game, for keeping wildlife openings that were available to them. So that really began to shrink the species range pretty quickly, as far back as 400 years ago. And this is kind of a nice broad shot of what a well-maintained longleaf forest can look like. This one is a little bit in transition because there are some loblolly pines in there, and that's kind of typical for what we have today. We'll have some older trees like you see in this photo, older longleaf pine, which the RCWs are really tied intimately with. because it's that fire-maintained ecosystem that they relied on. You have a park-like opening. The trees are well spaced. A lot of light hits the forest floor. So you have high herbaceous diversity. That's your grasses, your wildflowers, forbs, and so on. And with that comes a high insect diversity and high biomass. So the RCWs have plenty of food source. They feed on the longleaf pine trees and other pine trees, loblolly pine, shortleaf pine, pitch pine in some areas, pond pine, slash pine in Florida. And the insects, mainly spiders, small roaches, ants, caterpillars, and the like, that crawl up the bole of the longleaf pine and other pines. The RCWs work up and down those trees collecting food throughout the day. So as I've been speaking about longleaf pine, you're looking at the historic range, which encompassed approximately 93 million acres. There's a famous naturalist, Bartram, who traveled from North Carolina and in 3 weeks never left longleaf pine when he got to Georgia. So you can appreciate the immensity of the scale of that habitat, ranging from Tidewater area, Virginia, south to nearly Lake Okeechobee when the Florida slash pine kind of pushed back a little bit, and then into, I think it's the Black Hills region in Alabama and Mississippi, then down through Louisiana and Texas. So you had on top of that what would be considered atypical or marginal habitat for RCWs, but what we know now, it's very different. We had RCWs all the way into the Great Smoky Mountains, and including in Kentucky and Tennessee in what's considered montane RCW habitat, which is just wild to think about. So there's that. Here's kind of our current snapshot of what we're looking at for RCW habitat throughout the Southeast. We have in North Carolina, in particular, the North Carolina Sandhills, Blaine Lake State Forest, Blaine Lakes State Park, like Singletary, or I should say Singletary State Park, and other areas in there. And these are large chunks of longleaf pine landscape that we have remaining in North Carolina that serve as these reservoirs for the species. And the biggest thing that you can take away from this map is look at the map scale, and you see it's graduated into 50, 100, 200, 300 miles. A lot of our populations are 100, 200, and 300 miles apart. And there's not a lot of connectivity in between those populations. And that's going to be a major, major challenge and hurdle in the coming years for recovering this species. And talk about that later. But in our area, we have the North Carolina Sandhills complex, which is composed of Sandhills Game Lands and Fort Bragg. Military installations have been extremely vital in the sustainment of the species, just because military training activities require large landscapes to train on. And then closer to home, we have Camp Lejeune in Onslow County. And then in Brunswick County, we have Boiling Spring Lakes, Military Ocean Terminal Sunny Point, that has RCWs on it. Then a little bit further to the north of New Hanover County, we have Holly Shelter Game Land, which has approximately 40 clusters of red-cockaded woodpeckers currently. So to get into the bird itself and what they require, this is a really pretty example of a cavity tree. And cavity trees can be constructed in longleaf pine, loblolly pine, pond pine, shortleaf, and slash pine. I'm not wholly aware of many other species being utilized for that, and partly due to longleaf pine in particular produces a lot of resin. And you can see those sap wells above the cavity entrance. You can see our little guy peeking out right here. You can see these cavity wells here and here, and then what's called the heart face around the cavity itself. And what happens is the birds will slowly chisel away after they construct, during construction of the cavity, and then afterwards they maintain them. But then you see the tree just pumps out sap from these areas during the growing season, and it covers the tree in sap, and it's called, colloquially referred to as candlesticking, because the tree takes on a white candlestick look in the forest. And you have what this is for is deterring predators like raccoons, small mammals, snakes, from being able to climb the tree. For mammals in particular, their fur will get gummed up with that resin, particularly in the summertime. And I can directly attest to that, having had gobs of sap fall into my hair and have to cut them out with scissors. So the tree is producing all the sap in response to those sap wells being carved in the tree, and the birds utilize that as a defensive mechanism that helps protect them. And as a side note as well, that tree or that cavity can take anywhere from 6 months to 6 years to construct, because they're in living trees. That's another unique adaptation for the species, is that they make their cavities in living trees. So that is, the unique strategy that they don't share with other woodpecker species like the hairy, downy, flicker, pileated, that they require intact living trees. You'll see some birds that will stay around in a tree after it's been struck by lightning or killed by beetles. The males will rehabitate, or birds will rehabitate that tree just in kind of a last ditch effort. And then a view inside that tree. We're going to kind of go through a little bit of a breeding cycle, which we are in right now. These birds start nesting in North Carolina around May 10th. So some of our populations in the area, like Sunny Point, Boiling Spring Lakes, Holly Shelter, Camp Lejeune, should be seeing eggs at this point. And you can see 2 little eggs down in the corner right here. The female's incubating those currently. And again, I only say female because I can't see red on her at the moment. The male and female do share that responsibility. And that is another unique adaptation for the species, is they are considered a cooperative breeder, meaning that you have a male and female pair that defend a distinct territory year-round. And either a previous year's male or female helper, males are more common, and they have a set number of cavity trees that they protect, because those cavity trees are a very calorically exhaustive resource to construct and then defend. So this is a non-migratory species. They require intact landscape. So as I said earlier, their historic landscape was approximately 98 million acres. And one territory for this bird consists of the cavity trees themselves. That's the cluster core. And you have its foraging habitat, and that can be anywhere from 10 to 75 acres or even more. So a better look at those 3 eggs here that you could see underneath the incubating bird. The hatch cycle for this is extremely quick. This is 10 to 12 days. This is one of the fastest hatch times for bird species in North America that I know of. And they hatch out, and I apologize, I sometimes get this wrong, precocial. I have a couple of people that will be very irritated with me if I get that wrong. So they're born helpless. They're not born with the ability to see. They don't have any feathers. They are naked and afraid, and they sound like little dinosaurs in that cavity. They grow very quickly. This is just a few days post that initial photo. So these are about 5 days old. And part of the management for the species, because it's a federally endangered species, is extensive management throughout the year in monitoring and making sure that they're reproducing successfully. These are approximately 7-day-old birds right here. During my stint at Camp Lejeune, well, approximately 6-7 years ago, this is one of the primary things that we did, was banding RCWs as part of that populations management for modeling efforts that were done to ensure that the military could conduct their necessary training exercises. And this is what you would see if you walked into the cluster this time of year, potentially a little bit later. Birds coming back and forth to the cavity tree, bringing food to feed those nestlings. And if I'm not mistaken, this photo was actually taken by a friend who just recently passed away, Don Mullaney, in Holly Shelter Game Land. But this bird was scoped out for some time because we watched it go back and forth, feeding those nestlings. And like I said, that's all occurring in this open park-like longleaf savanna, where they have sufficient biomass to be able to go back and forth throughout the day in that massive amount of acres that they require, anywhere from that 10 to 75 acres that they require as their base. And this is what they'd be feeding on. You have black wood ants or carpenter ants, and then you have wood roaches, and then spiders. That's a majority of their diet. So those individuals that have RCWs in an urban or suburban setting, like Boiling Spring Lakes and the Southern Pines area of North Carolina, where you can literally have an RCW cavity in your front yard, there are certain prohibitions from pesticide application, because you could literally be poisoning an endangered species by killing their food source. So it's not that we can't live in concert with them, it's just that there are subtle challenges. And then this is what it looks like when you have to actually go to the tree and excise the nestlings from the tree at about 45 feet. Again, that's one of the challenges of management for the species, because it's a federally endangered species. This is all conducted very carefully, very delicately, but you're still doing it at 45 feet in the air or more. I know some biologists that have been much higher than 70 feet, and no thanks. And then that's what they look like in hand, just to give it a little bit of better idea as what the nestlings look like. They are, still blind at this point, or their eyes are closed. You have minimal feather tracks developing on the back and the wings. So, your impacts to putting those color bands on them for their unique identification is minimal. And then, as I said earlier, this is the telling characteristic of the males, is where you see that red dot on the top of their head, and then on the side of the head, the cockade. So the bird on the right was a female, bird on the left, the male. And that takes place at about 25 days post-hatch, 28 days, somewhere around there, very quick. And then that's what they require, big open habitat. Fire maintained. You can see the fire scars on the base of those trees. That's a regular interval return for fire, which in Southeast North Carolina is 3 to 5 years. Climate change might change that a little bit, might make that a little bit quicker. But there's the beautiful example of the grassy longleaf savanna. You have coastal 3-on wiregrass, blue stem, a little bit of inkberry, that's your broadleaf plant that's in there, that we don't want to get too high and can compete with the RCW cavities if they get to a certain height. And that's one of the challenging aspects for managing the species. If you can't get fire back into an area, you'll have what's called mid-story crowding, where the cavities will be essentially, crowded out by hardwood species or other pines that grow too quick. So this is the condition that you want to see it in for these birds to really survive and thrive. And I love using this photo because it always makes me stop and ponder what the bird that constructed this cavity was thinking, because that cavity is not 3 feet off the ground. And in terms of being able to protect it from predators, well, there's a reason why that cavity is inactive. There would have not been much chance for that to occur. But it's still just a really unique idea to think that a bird went through the effort of constructing a complete cavity in that longleaf, only 3 feet off the ground, but a very picturesque view nonetheless. And maybe that's what it was thinking. It's like, oh, nice view from the front door. So honing in a little bit for North Carolina, this is the current distribution for red-cockaded woodpeckers. I will say that there's probably a little bit of changes that need to be made to this map, in particular, our county, New Hanover County, that should be white. There are, to our knowledge, no RCWs left in New Hanover County. The last RCW that I am personally aware of that was in New Hanover County was Road Strike in 2003 or 4 in the Pine Valley area. There might have been some stragglers later on in the northern portions of the county, and maybe in the southwestern portion of the county, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. So we'll start talking about challenges that the species faces in the long term. And again, honing in on what I was mentioning earlier about that connectivity and where our current birds lie and some impacts that we're going to be seeing on these populations here soon. So in our area, in the Tri-County area, the Pender County, New Hanover County, Brunswick County, you have the populations that I mentioned earlier, the Brunswick complex and the Sunny Point population. Then you have in Pender County, Holly Shelter Game Land, and the Onslow County Camp Lejeune. You go a little bit further east, you have Croatan National Forest, and then you have an area that is what I fondly refer to as the weirdness, because this is an area where RCWs, according to all the typical metrics, should not exist. This is high Pocosin habitat, essentially freshwater swamp forest in some areas, but the RCWs there are surviving and thriving in really unique habitat for the species. Large emergent, and by emergent I mean they come out of that high Pocosin, pond pines and loblolly pines. And so when you get above that mid-story level, you're kind of looking up the top would look like the forest floor. But the birds are surviving up there. They have some unique challenges and impacts for their management. Again, actually ties into the saltwater intrusion that'll be discussed in another talk for Island Chapter for Wildlife Federation. So this map can kind of highlight the challenges that we're going to face in the coming years for this species and its long-term management and sustainability. And that is, how are these birds going to connect to each other? You have a lot of development occurring in this area, particularly this area. There is only one bridge left for RCWs to get from Brunswick County to New Hanover County and through to Holly Shelter. There's a little bit better of a bridge for Holly Shelter to Camp Lejeune, and then somewhat in between Camp Lejeune and Croatan National Forest. But in our area, we are facing some pretty intense urbanization and a rapid loss of habitat. And these birds require a very well-maintained forest to survive. And this is kind of the quintessential look of what we're looking for. And we don't really have that in New Hanover County anymore. There's a couple little stretches. You have Carolina Beach State Park, but that's only 600 acres. And a lot of that is not suitable for RCWs. They require trees to be at least 8 inches in diameter. I've seen them smaller than that. So, you're talking about a tree very, small in the scheme of things. And you're requiring a lot of them. And that gets me to this slide. So this is a little graphic that I made, but pulling data directly from the species U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Recovery Guide, which was the meeting of the minds in 2003, U.S. Fish and Wildlife together with multiple institutions and government agencies, state, federal, came together to develop a plan to manage and protect this species and get it to recovery. Recovery is when we can downlist the species from endangered to threatened and then to unlisted. And if anybody's been following the news recently, in particular with red-cockaded woodpeckers, which I'm sure everyone has been, there was a proposal by our previous administration to downlist the species. And that, in my personal opinion, was not based on sound science. It was done essentially behind closed doors in a lot of cases, because the species is not near a lot of the check boxes that we have for the recovery plan to make sure that the species can survive being dropped down to threatened status federally. So it loses some protections and funding, because that's a big aspect with the species, is having adequate funding to perform all of this management on the landscape, whether it be fire or artificial cavity installation and so on and so forth. Back to this slide. So this 75 acres, trying to give everyone a visual representation of what that looks like. So 1 square acre is 200 feet by 200 feet, approximately. So for the bare minimum on private lands, one cluster, one family group, that male, female, and the helper or helpers require 75 acres of that beautiful, picturesque longleaf pine stand to survive in. And then within that, to give you a tighter honing in on that, think of a garage, a typical 2-car garage, roughly 20 feet by 20 feet. So 1/10 of an acre. Within that 1/10 of an acre, you would need 5 trees at 10.5 inches in diameter, or a little bit bigger than that in some cases, but approximately a dinner plate if you look at it in cross section. So you'd need 5 of those per 1/10 acre. Now follow me on the math, which is not my strong suit. If you scale that up further and further, you're looking at roughly 3,000 trees at 10.5 inches in diameter for one family group. Let that sink in for a moment. That's a lot of trees that one group needs. And depending on the quality of the habitat, it could be even more. Sometimes it can be a little bit less. You hope that it's high enough quality for it to be less, but sometimes it's just not the case. So the barest minimum is that, 3,000 trees per group. Now, personally, in New Hanover County and in Wilmington, I can't think of any areas that have 3,000 trees, 10.5 inches in diameter. So there is the big takeaway, is that habitat loss is what has driven the species to the brink. And then alteration of the historical fire regimes. Like you see right here, good fire for RCWs is historically associated with summertime or late spring fire, where you would either have lightning, or most likely lightning strike in the southeast. But before that, you could potentially have native people setting fires to the landscape to either drive game or just keep it open for a variety of purposes. And so that fire would carry potentially miles and miles and miles and miles historically until it hit a water body, be it the ocean or a river or a bottomland, hardwood forest, swamp, you name it. But now we are relegated to having to artificially prescribe this fire regime. And that is so we can keep it from looking like this. This is actually the middle of a longleaf pine forest. And for those of you that aren't aware, behind UNCW, along Rose Avenue, along the Cross City Trail, UNCW has a fragment of some of the most incredible longleaf pine forest in the area. And this photo is taken from the middle of that forest. And this is a fire suppressed forest. You have mid-story encroachment from all of these guys are here. This is a complex of inkberry. There's some holly in there. Just a whole suite of species. There's a red bay right there, but not that open park-like setting that you have to maintain for the species. So UNCW is a fine example of what happens when you no longer have the ability or the support to put fire on the ground. And that is the challenge. And it's not just a challenge for RCWs, because there is a suite of species, and it's a broad one in the Southeast, that make their home in longleaf pine ecosystems that without that, we're going to see them disappear. No, these are labeled. I apologize for that. This is a Bachmann Sparrow. Bachmann Sparrows are unique because it's been found that they actually have a stronger association of fire-maintained longleaf than RCWs. They really need that fire-maintained open habitat to survive and reproduce. And currently, they have no federal protected status other than Migratory Bird Treaty Act protections. So that's a little bit unfortunate. The closest that you can find are Bachmann sparrows in our area is Holly Shelter Game Land. And then the top right here, this is one of my absolute favorite animals aside from RCWs. This is the Carolina gopher frog. This is a incredibly imperiled species throughout its range, but in particular North Carolina, because you have only a few populations left. And it's because it's another species that requires a large amount of habitat in order to survive. And they require fishless ponds that fill up in the late winter from our typical winter rains in the middle of longleaf savanna. So these are really unique pond systems. And the frogs can migrate from huge distances for an individual that maxes out at maybe 3.5 inches, miles. These guys will travel from their stump hole to the pond. So they require big open spaces and that longleaf pine habitat intimately tied in with the management for RCWs. And then another species near and dear to my heart, this is roughleaf loosestrife. This is a federally endangered plant that is found in our area. Used to be, I wouldn't say somewhat common in northern New Hanover County, but it is an area where they were known to occur with some frequency. And it is another species that requires that fire maintained ecosystem that is so important, not just, again, for the RCW, but for too many species to even try and go through in one presentation. And then some unique challenges. I know everybody loves eastern bluebirds. I don't. I'm kidding. I do like eastern bluebirds. I don't like them when they go after RCWs, because they do. Eastern bluebirds, when they are in the longleaf pine forest and there is an abundance of suitable cavities, whether it be in dead trees or RCW trees, RCW cavity trees, bluebirds will share and be okay. However, when there is cavity competition, the bluebird will strike. Bluebirds, I've watched bluebirds kill RCWs for the cavity itself. So that's another challenge that we face. And then here's kind of the group of 4 that are another challenge for RCW management. You have the red-headed woodpecker, pileated woodpecker, southern flying squirrel, and red-bellied woodpecker. And these species will either, in regards to the woodpeckers, they'll either expand the cavities, alter them so RCWs can't use them anymore, or kick them out. Flying squirrels will just occupy cavities, so the RCWs have fewer and fewer cavities to use. Historically, when you had a huge landscape of longleaf pine ecosystem, that wasn't such a big deal. When we have these very small populations and you have an overabundance of any one of these 4 species, 5 including bluebird, you can have some issues. And here's a great example of that. The tree here, these pictures are just taken months apart, if not weeks. And this is the result of a pileated woodpecker damaging and altering this cavity tree. You have the nice clean RCW cavity, which is not much bigger than that. And then this is expanded by the pileated woodpecker to the point where I could fit my fist inside that cavity and almost reach the RCW nestlings that were in there. And they successfully fledged that year. So one more challenge atop everything else. And then at the end of the life cycle for the cavity trees, they can be inhabited by a whole other group of animals, including bats, frogs, snakes, other birds. This is a great example of a great crested flycatcher occupying this cavity from a dead RCW cavity tree. And so these trees serve a huge purpose on the landscape and longleaf ecosystem as being part of an interconnected web for serving the woodpeckers for many, many years. And then when the tree is finally dies and is no longer suitable for their use, then a whole new group of animals can move in over time and utilize that cavity. This is what you don't want to see when you're doing RCW management, and that is a tree that has been recently struck by lightning. It's dying. The birds are still using it, but they don't have a sufficient number of cavity trees that they have constructed to support them on the landscape. So you have to go in and provide them new cavity trees, which is a really unique process. And one aspect that I don't believe I mentioned earlier is why RCWs in part utilize longleaf and some other, the other pine trees. And my reminder is right here. This is a fungal conch that you see on the bole of the tree. And that is the fruiting body of the red heart fungus group that infects longleaf, pond pine, loblolly, and what it does is it softens the heartwood of the tree to the point where an RCW can bore through the living cambium, which can be, very narrow or very thick, and construct its cavity. And that's the reason why they use only a select number of trees on the landscape. Otherwise, you could have every tree out there being utilized. And then another challenge when you're managing RCWs is making sure that trees don't light on fire during prescribed burning activities. That was not a cavity tree, but it's just a fun picture. And then you have events like we are so well known to in our area, hurricanes or severe thunderstorms that cause wind throw, and they will snap the cavity trees. And you can see that right here. There's the cavity entrance, and literally the tree broke at that weak point. That's not necessarily always the weakest point on the tree. It just, that happens. It can be susceptible. And we have techniques that allow us to provide artificial cavities for RCWs. This is a photograph of me from 7 years ago or so, constructing an artificial cavity. I'm using what's called the drill cavity technique, or the Copion drill cavity technique, developed in the early 90s to provide a artificial cavity much faster than an RCW can. These cavities can be constructed in as little as 30 to 40 minutes with a skilled operator. It takes me an hour back then. So because it takes a lot of finesse and a lot of technique, and it's just something you want to get right. So we can go in as managers and very quickly provide the RCWs with a fresh, usable cavity for them to occupy. And it's done by constructing 2 holes into the tree. The one at the bottom that you see, that's the entrance tunnel. That's where the bird goes to and from. The one on top is what is used to actually create the cavity cup at the bottom where the bird will roost, or just live in there with eggs sometimes. So it's a very quick process. If you're a carpenter, you're very familiar with wood putty. And when you're doing RCW management, you get very familiar with wood putty. There's another technique called the box insert technique, where you literally cut a box-shaped cut into the tree, pop out some of the panels after you've taken a chainsaw, very scary, and pop that in there with a lot of wood putty and shims to align it. But you have to have a larger diameter tree to do so, and it requires periodic maintenance, whereas the drill cavities, it's one and done. You check that to make sure that there's no sap breached into the cavity, and once it's clear, you open it up and the birds can utilize it right away. The box inserts were kind of an emergency technique developed and implemented after Hurricane Hugo devastated Francis Marion National Forest. And the gentleman that developed the box insert technique, David Allen with the Wildlife Resource Commission, is one of the big reasons why we've been able to quickly increase RCWs in certain populations throughout the Southeast, because managers had a new tool where you could provide instant cavities for the birds. So you could make instant habitat, and they could either occupy it or you could move them from other areas to that new population as a recipient. And so then this is what you hope for afterwards, is that the birds will take to it and construct sap wells all over it, and they'll put their nest in there, and you'll be very proud of your work. And then this is a bisected view of what that cavity should look like. This is a natural cavity. So you have that cavity entrance right here. and then the actual cavity itself. And you can see that the color of the wood is slightly different. This is that heartwood that's been infected by the red harsh fungus sweet that has softened that inner core of wood that allows it to be easily accessed and bored out by the RCWs. And that kind of gets onto the point that these birds are going to be facing in the coming years and decades, where our efforts, even with cavity construction, artificial cavity construction and such, can't keep up with the impacts that they're going to face, whether it be from development or a more broad-reaching impact, and that's climate change. In our area in particular, you can see the map here showing non-tidal wetlands and the other metrics here, tidal wetlands, a lot of green on this side of the county, and non-tidal wetlands here. This is showing inundation for elevation in meters. So have a lot of habitat that we're going to start seeing some alterations in our area. And the RCWs, being that they have to have that high quality habitat, people are going to be looking at that as where we go next, because a lot of times RCW habitat is a high and dry habitat. So we're going to see more pressure from development, especially if, heaven forbid, we do lose endangered status at the current moment for this species. And developers and other interests can change usage for their habitat and allow it to be altered and manipulated, either to be housing developments or roadways that need to be relocated with climate change, because that will be the reality. And as I mentioned very early on, this is the Albemarle Peninsula, and we have quite a few RCWs up here. And we have what's going to occur is saltwater intrusion and inundation, where their habitat in this particular area and then further north, going to the northern extent of the range, is going to be changed irreversibly due to saltwater intrusion. And we're going to lose tens of thousands of acres of habitat. And this is the reality of what's going to occur, unfortunately. Coupled with that is going to be an increase in incidents from hurricane strikes, because climate change is going to change the intensity and number of hurricanes that could impact the East Coast, as we have seen recently. So this is not hypothetical. This isn't 50 years in the future. This is today. This is the challenges that we will face. So, despite the efforts of individuals like myself and the other, fantastic biologists out there, trying to do everything we can to preserve this species, we're going to face a much bigger and much more difficult challenge, and that's going to be the impact from climate change and what that does to our weather patterns, our local weather patterns, and our overall climate patterns. We could be seeing drier summers or wetter summers, drier winters, wetter winters. Don't really know right now. That's why some say it's global weirding, because we're not exactly sure what's going to occur. And then, as I mentioned earlier on as well, population growth. Everyone that's tuning into this presentation from the southeastern North Carolina and even beyond, I'm sure everyone has seen what explosive growth has occurred in this area in just the past 10 years. We really didn't see the impacts from the 2008 recession like other areas of the country did. That has really changed our area and made impacts in the very near term to the RCWs that we have left. So we're just going to keep going up and up and up in population. And with that, I will pull up some other interesting photos that I couldn't get into the PowerPoint at the time. But I wanted everyone to see what I was referring to in terms of that population growth. This is New Hanover County and Brunswick County in 1991. So take that in for a moment and see, oh, there's a little bit more green here and there and everywhere. And it didn't jump to where I wanted, so we'll just go back. This is New Hanover County today. This area is filled in. This is West Bay, Ogden area, Kirkland area, Porter's Neck. This is River Lights. This is Leland, Navassa area. We have seen a rapid explosion in growth in this area and conversion of habitat that not only impacts RCWs, but impacts people as well, from impacts from stormwater infrastructure, flooding, as many in this area have seen and experienced. It's going to be a challenge, and these are photos that not pointing fingers at anybody or trying to pick on anyone, but this is the River Lights community in southwestern New Hanover County that I mentioned earlier. This is from 1999, so just 22 years ago. This longleaf forest that was here, to put it lightly, was some of the most beautiful longleaf forest that I've gotten a chance to lay eyes on. And I've seen a lot in North Carolina, but this was so unique. Very rolling topography, much like the sandhills in the central portion of the state near Fort Bragg and Sandhills Game Land. Just stunning. And the longleafs that are, the few that are still there, they're kind of the sentinels for what was. But that's the threat, the major threat that we face. And so here's 1999 or 2019. So you go from 1999 to 2019. Look at this rapid growth, this conversion of landscape. And there are ways that this could have been done differently to reduce the impact from this community rather than just wholesale devastation, clear cut, which is unfortunate because the people that live here now are going to have, thinking really small, higher energy bills just because they don't have trees, so they don't have shading, so they have to have higher air conditioner costs. They don't have the water absorption associated with having mature forest around them. There's a lot to losing our forest. And it's not just the loss for these imperiled species, but it's the loss that we experience as well in losing these unique assets. Let's see. This is a somewhat blurry photo, but there's a point to this one that's unfortunately funny. Through here is where the bypass is. The I-140 bypass kind of cut right through here. This is West Bay area, Ogden, really not what you expect today. These is some really unique habitat and landscape out here. You see these little fingers right here. As a colleague of mine would say, crenulations on the landscape. This is just microtopography that was found in this area in particular that led to unique habitat communities in this area in particular. And there were red-cockaded woodpeckers here just 20 years ago. We had RCWs in northern New Hanover County. So take that in for a moment. And that's today. So that's the bypass. This is Sidbury Road, which is now the target of some pretty immense development going on currently. And then this is the West Bay Estates area. And then you have everything north of the 140 bypass. There was an RCW cavity tree in this area just 20 less years ago. There was a cluster that was in this area, and they winked out. And now they're having even more pressure from this additional spur, or the habitat's having more pressure because there are no more birds left in northern New Hanover County. And it's unfortunate. Now let's see if I can find one of the reasons why I saved that. There it is. This is the most telling photo of northern New Hanover County of why habitat loss is so broad scope in its impact, because someone decided that, maybe I'll name this road right here for this bird that's found nearby, red-cockaded court. And I've driven up to this sign many times and looked at it and kind of sighed, because that's not what it looks like anymore. Immense alteration of habitat. The birds that it was named for have long since disappeared. But that's not to say that we can't continue the fight and try and protect what we have that's left. Because if we only talk doom and gloom, that's all we're going to get. And this is that northern New Hanover County extent. We have Sidbury Road here, the I-140 bypass, Holly Shelter Road. This is all the big target for developers right now. Wilmington Business Journal named this the last great opportunity for New Hanover County. Personally, that kind of offended me because this area was a surface recharge water zone for CAMA for many years. And I'm just wondering why that changed in terms of importance for wetlands and our water, which is so important in our area to have good drinking water. With the impacts from Gen X and other issues that we have. So I don't necessarily know if I need to go through all of those photos, but another one that some may recognize where this photo was taken, others may not. This is Longleaf Park in New Hanover County. This is, to me, one of the prettiest examples for a longleaf forest, because some of the trees in here are just massive and very old, and it's everything that you'd want to see on the landscape. So instead of St. Augustine or centipede grass, you'd much rather see wiregrass and wildflowers and just everything that should be there. And that's kind of what I see in my mind's eye every time I drive by this park. But the really funny thing with Longleaf Park is this. It's not the greatest photo because I did take it with my phone, but if you go near the playground by the parking area in Longleaf Park and look up, if you're looking towards the playground, you might be lucky enough to spot this tree. And this is a relic RCW cavity tree. There is a story here about how this bird is now just kind of a whisper of where it once was. And this tree speaks to me every time I see it in thinking, man, it just wasn't that long ago that they were here. And the more ironic thing about this tree is that it's being used by European starlings now. So that takes us kind of full circle as to loss for the species and why it's so important that we protect what we have left and do everything we can to mitigate our impacts in development and use of our area and our resources. So with that, I will close and take questions.
Carson, thank you so much. That was amazing and incredibly informative and at times quite moving. We have several questions in the chat box. Catherine is asking, are there programs in place to assist large privately owned property managers to understand the red-cockaded woodpeckers population that is present, and programs aimed at preserving such spaces?
There are. In particular, there's something called the Safe Harbor program that's implemented by North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And what it does is it acts as a protections for the bird and the property owner. Mm-hmm. It allows the property owner to conduct actions on site that don't interfere necessarily with what they want to do, whether it be pine straw raking, forestry management practices, historic uses like quail plantations, or there's a whole suite of things that can be utilized, but it allows the property owner to kind of go with their historic use for the land, but also protecting the RCWs that are there. So if they say one day, okay, I want to build a home site on the property and it's going to impact an RCW cluster, well, there are then protections that are engaged that say, okay, maybe we can do this, this, and this a different way so we can maintain those birds, but get you what you would like on your landscape. Okay. So the Sandhills has the federal Safe Harbor program, and then the rest of North Carolina has the state Safe Harbor program. If that's a little bit of a answer to the question.
It is. Lauren Farr, who we actually had speak about a week or so ago, is asking for the monitoring process when banding. I know you want to ban nestlings at 10 days old. What is that process like up to when the nestlings hatch? Do you go to check the cavities daily to know when nestlings hatched and when to band? I'm currently a PhD student at North Carolina State who will be researching brood reduction in RCWs on the Sandhills gameland, so I thoroughly enjoyed and learned a ton from your presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. So 10 days would actually be a little bit too old for banding. They'd be slightly large, so it could be potentially harmful to pull the nestling at that point. You really want to hit the sweet spot at about 7 days old, just when you're starting to see, pardon me if my anatomy is slightly off, the rectrices coming out from the back will be darkening to a little bit of a Y. And if you go past that and their eyes are open and they can see, then they're a little bit too big at that point. So what you do is you cycle through. Once you find eggs, you say, okay, day one. If you have one egg, then you say, okay, if they continue to lay for the next couple of days, then you could have as many as 4 eggs. I'll come back in 8 to 10 days and see what I've got. That way, you're typically hitting it in the right time frame for hatching and then monitoring. That's if I have my memory straight on all of that. It's been a few years since I've done direct monitoring in management, but the key thing is 10 days would be too old. So what were the other aspects of that question? Because I know that there was a lot to unpack from that one.
Let's see, what is that process like up to when the nestlings hatch? And do you go to check the cavities daily to know when nestlings hatched and when to band?
Okay. So daily would be too frequently. That's why I said you have that period that you go back to for a return. And so you literally have a calendar, you mark it in there. And all of that information is actually found in the recovery plan because we all have to hold to the same standard.
And let's see, Jill Lucis is asking, how do researchers work to keep genetic diversity when the RCW areas are so far and few between? Do the birds have trouble with sap getting on their flight feathers? Are other species more likely to have issues with the sap if they take over an RCW cavity? If so, is this a deterrent for other species even trying to take over their nest trees? Thanks, Carson, for all you do for this species and for this program tonight.
So I'll start with the beginning with the genetic isolation. And this is a major issue because there's a principle associated with this. It's a stochastic number that if a RCW population, so that's all of the family groups, falls under 30 clusters, you'll start to see some degradation for genetic viability. Going further and further below that, then you really start to see some impacts. And a prime example of that occurrence was in the Piney Grove Preserve in Virginia, where just a few years ago, they had fallen to only a few clusters remaining. And so the Nature Conservancy in Virginia, along with Virginia DGIF, Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, asked the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to allow them to be recipients for RCWs from a recovered population. And I think those were donated from the Sandhills National Wildlife Refuge in South Carolina. Part of the way that you become a donor population is you have reached recovery for your population. And populations that can be different numbers of family groups. 500 is a nice goal. That's a big population. Others are different. Everybody has a unique number. So they go through the process of translocation, where you capture adult birds from a donor population and transport them overnight, or very close to. You got to hustle to get them into their recipient cavities in the new population. Has just occurred in Great Dismal in Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, where birds have been reintroduced to that habitat as well. So yes, genetic diversity is a very challenging issue for maintaining this species. And it's one that we're going to face further and further. Will the question come, do we need to just start mixing up populations because they're so isolated from each other that birds can't naturally immigrate to and from those populations? There, a quick side note and fun story. When I was at Camp Lejeune, we got a phone call from the RCW guy for Holly Shelter Game Land saying, I have a banded bird that I've seen, because Holly Shelter is a completely unbanded population. And so it's like, well, this is really unique, and we're the closest ones to respond to this. So we went to Holly Shelter, conducted an evening capture, which was really near and dear to my heart because that's where I cut my teeth on RCW management in 2009. So going back there to actually capture a bird and identify it was really fun and special. And we identified this as a female from Croatan National Forest. So she did a lot of traveling to get from Croatan to Holly Shelter, going through a lot of different areas potentially. But it told us, all right, we still have some connectivity where this bird was able to come from that disparate population and move through different areas, Jacksonville, Holly Ridge, that area and such, and get Holly Shelter and find other RCWs. So it's really, in the end, a heartwarming kind of story, is that bird was able to find a new home.
Catherine Clifton is asking, is safe harbor also applicable in South Carolina?
Safe harbor does have South Carolina does have a safe harbor program as well. And it actually has a lot of enrollees. They have over 300, I believe, or 300 clusters. I'll be honest, I don't know the specific figure. I just know that they're a very successful program, and my hat's off to them.
Wonderful. Well, this was absolutely fantastic. I appreciate you taking so much care with this talk. I've learned an incredible amount, and I'm sure that everyone who's gathered here has also. We're getting lots of positive comments in the chat. And Carson, if anyone has further questions, are you willing to provide your email address when we send out the recording?
Certainly.
Great.
And I thought this was only part 1, and I was going to do part 2, 3, 4, and this is just intermission. Is that right?
We can do that. We can do that.
There's a lot.
Well, let's talk. Let's talk soon. But this was fantastic, and I really appreciate it so much.
It was my pleasure. I hope everyone enjoyed.
We did. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah.